Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for March 7th, 2024, and I'm JD Duran, and I am very excited for this conversation because we're going to be talking about a style of film that I tend to really like. We'll get more into that here in a second, but first and foremost, I need to introduce my guest for this episode. You may notice the great Brendan Cassidy is not here. He's been a little under the weather this week. However, our guest was always scheduled to be here because he has been looking forward to talking about this film for some time. Joining me for this is the great Jacob Throneberry. Jacob, welcome back to the show, my friend.
Hey, I'm glad to be back. It seems like just yesterday that I was doing a show with you. So,
Indeed. Yeah. So for some inside baseball, Jacob joined me literally yesterday to discuss this film, and we had some technical issues and we lost all of the audio and video, unfortunately. So we are back to have the conversation again.
If people don't think we put in the work, we're putting in the work.
We're putting in the work.
Time.
So I doubly thank Jacob for being here for this conversation of Spaceman, a movie that I know you've been looking forward to for some time. I noticed you tweeting about this earlier in the year, especially when the trailer dropped. You were very much hyped for this movie, which is very exciting because they announced this, in 2020, I believe you said it was the first time it was on your radar?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, there were two movies. That from either beginning or right around COVID that I have been having on my radar. One of them was Barbie, which I first tweeted about in July of 2019. COVID to me wasn't even prickling in my brain.
Yeah.
But the second was Spaceman, and that was something that I think I went back and looked on. I went back and looked through all of my tweets and stuff, and I think the first time that I tweeted about it was in early of 2021. I think March or April of 2021, and I had tweeted about it because I had just seen Chernobyl, which of course is directed by Johan Renck, who does this. So I had just seen Chernobyl. I was watching everything that I could during COVID, and I was floored by the show and the performances and the style of it, and I thought that it was just magnificent. And I was really interested. I mean, I keep up with everything Adam Sandler does. It doesn't matter what it is. I've had more people than you could imagine text me today about the Adam Sandler, Noah Baumbach, George Clooney, coming of age
together, for sure,
movie, which is like just that is a fastball right down the middle, like so up my alley. But yeah, so I keep up with everything I can. Adam Sandler, he's one of my favorite actors, probably of all time. So yeah, so I think it was early 2021 that I heard that this film was in the work. I got the book. I started trying to read some of the book, and just keeping up with it for years. And I think it was early 2022 that they were actually doing some test screenings of it. And I mean, when I tell you, I was like on Letterboxd trying to see if people were breaking NDAs, trying to look at the what they were thinking of the test screenings. I have been all about this film for years, and luckily for me, it didn't disappoint. There were some things here and there, and we'll get into that. But yeah, I've been looking forward to it for years, and it's amazing to see it finally come to fruition.
Yeah, that's very exciting. I was not familiar with the novel. It's based on Spaceman of Bohemian by Yaroslav Kalfar. I'm not sure if I'm
Mhm.
saying that right, but I have not read the novel that this film is adapting. And as I noted, I wasn't too aware of it. I had some inclination of what it could be, but it wasn't until, as I noted earlier, I saw you mentioning and talking about this movie that it really started to get on my radar. And then some reviews dropped. They started invoking titles that then really enhanced my excitement for this film. So I was very much ready to get on Netflix a week ago when this film came out and to watch it. So I'm very eager to get into this conversation. So with that, I think we can transition into the review here. As you noted, it is directed by Johan Renck and it stars Adam Sandler, Carey Mulligan, Paul Dano, Isabella Rossellini in a small role, as well as a few others that come and go throughout the film. If you're not familiar with Spaceman, half a year into his solo mission on the edge of the solar system, an astronaut concerned with the state of his life back on Earth is helped by an ancient creature he discovers in the bowels of his ship. All right, let's jump into this. Jacob, what did you think about Spaceman?
Um, yeah, so as I mentioned, with the knowledge of the novel, I was always wondering what path they were actually going to take with the film. The novel is very heavy into the politics of the Czech Republic, um, and the novel is very heavy on his father's dealings with the Communist Party, being an informant,
Yeah,
and how
yeah.
that kind of affected his life. So I was wondering going into it how much they would go into that, and of course, for anyone who has seen the movie, they don't really. They just briefly touch on it, but I do think what they ultimately um, landed on was something that I really connected with. I thought that the story of isolation and the story of loneliness and that kind of longing to like want to shoot for a higher purpose, but at the same time, who are you going to be? Who are you going to be leaving behind? And are you willing to leave those people behind? And I thought Adam Sandler gave a fantastic performance. I know we'll get into that soon.
Hmm.
I feel like for me, actually, I went back and rewatched Eternal Sunshine today, and it really kind of reinforced that fact um, of the similarities between Jim Carrey's performance in Eternal Sunshine and Adam Sandler's in Spaceman. Of course, Eternal Sunshine, in my opinion, is a far better film. Um, I, although I think it's one of the best, but that aside, there's such a softness and such
Hmm.
there's such a clear sense of pathos with him that is probably the furthest he stretched himself as an actor, and
Hmm.
I thought that
Yeah.
was brilliant. I had a couple issues with some of the writing. I don't place all the blame on the writer because I know what he's trying to juggle was a lot. Um, but I thought that for me, the visuals, the performance from Adam Sandler, the performance from Paul Dano, even the performance from Carey Mulligan, I thought were all magnificent.
Hmm.
And I know we'll talk about it more. We talked about it a lot yesterday, but the score from Max Richter
Hmm.
was phenomenal. What I of course, my hopes were high. Did they meet those expectations? Not entirely, but I still came away from it having a really great appreciation for the film.
Yeah, I quite dug the film as well. This is my kind of sci-fi. Stylistically, it's heavily inspired by films like Solaris, Ad Astra, Annihilation, High Life, with elements of First Man thrown in there as well. And I love all of those movies. I haven't read the novel it's based on, as I noted, but I love the wandering sensibilities and ruminative ethos that we see here. It plays out narratively most closely to Solaris in the sense that you have a lonely spaceman played by Adam Sandler who is grappling with his past and current grief, but instead of it being funneled through a ghostly replicant, as we see in Solaris, it's ciphered through this giant spider by the name of Hanush, voiced by Paul Dano. On an emotional and therapeutic level, though, both films play out very similarly, as we see Chris work out his insecurities through this new version of his wife in Solaris, or in the case of Spaceman, Jacob grappling with his childhood memories and neglect of his wife in his conversations with Hanush. They're both very therapeutically driven stories in that regard, and I love that approach to this film. I don't know if it all works with, like you, there are some scripting problems that I don't think the film quite overcomes, but I think the film is far more effective than it isn't, especially because of the film's raw and quiet melancholy. Like many of those aforementioned films, there isn't a conventional narrative here. There are Mulligan motifs and repetitive tropes. There's a poeticism to its rhythms and editing. It's perhaps a little slighter than its sci-fi brethren, but I really liked what this film was aiming for in terms of its ideas and Sandler's performance. You're right, we'll talk more about him as we go here, but he's very good, and Max Richter is a god. His score to this film, I agree, is excellent. It's so good. He and sci-fi are synonymous with one another, and man, does he pack a punch here. So yeah, I'm with you. It's not perfect, but I overall really liked it a lot.
Yeah. I just, thinking back, it's like you said, like this is the kind of sci-fi that I really relate to. It reminds me of, stuff similar to like Moon with Sam Rockwell, and kind of just that isolated sensibilities and yeah, I think it's just told with such softness and such compassion and care, and
Mm-hmm.
in a way that like I said, I really gravitated to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's what I love about the film's stylistic approach. And I don't know what Johan Renck was specifically inspired by. I don't know if he's mentioned it in any interviews, but you'll certainly notice its uh, Solaris sensibilities, especially, or something like Ad Astra, where those films aren't emphasizing some larger political grand, narrative. They're funneling something more poetic, something human, something individualistic, and that is absolutely at the core of this film. And I really do like that approach here. I think that perhaps limits blemishes that could have been here in the screenplay. I know we talked about this quite a bit yesterday. Unfortunately, it wasn't recorded because of technology. But you were talking about the adaptation and how this film removes a lot of its politicism. And
Mhm.
I love that approach because it allows for those humanistic qualities to be front and center, for the film to emphasize that more. So this film doesn't have to get bogged down in not just politics, but in nationality, as Jakub is this Czech astronaut who is, exploring this purple cloud in the sky, and he's the first one there. There's the South Koreans in hot pursuit as well. And so he's trying to do a job. And in the novel, as at least what you were saying yesterday, there is this political nationalism element to the novel that is very much removed here. And I think that is a great choice because it removes borders and allows for us to just tap into the humanism that is at the core of this film, whether that be between Jacob and his wife Linka, or between Jacob and Hanush. I certainly want to talk about Hanush here in a little bit as well, but like those dynamics here, I think are something that regardless of where you come from or what your background is, you can empathize with these characters and the grief that they are grappling with.
Yeah. Some of the I still haven't finished the book. I know there's so much, but one of the biggest differences for me that especially through the first 150-ish pages was the book takes a big emphasis on his childhood, and it takes a big emphasis on the trauma in his life, and his grandparents are a big part of the book, and they're entirely omitted. But I think for people who read the novel or know the novel going into it, one of my initial kind of questions about it was how quickly they had jumped into everything without really any explanation. The book does a great job of explaining, his father was an informant, and he basically lived his whole life getting bullied, getting almost killed for his father's mistakes, and that's kind of what drew him to wanting to turn his name, the Prochaska name, into a heroic name rather than being one of I can't think of the word. Basically, like one of evil or whatever. So that was one thing they did differently. But from what I remember, it goes much deeper into the relationship between Lenka and Jakob in the movie, which I thought was a great way to do it if that's what you're going to do. It's like you said. I mean, the nationality of it all, of course. Adam Sandler is not Czech, neither is Carey Mulligan, and they don't try to be, which is interesting. And in the book, it's Russians that save them from the cloud, and in the movie, it's
understandable
South Korea.
why they remove that.
Yeah,
and you're right. That's a great point you make too about the performances, and I certainly want to talk about Mulligan and Sandler as well. But aside from the humanistic perspective of empathizing with these characters when you remove those borders, and not to undermine the Czech perspective, I don't want to come off crass in that regard, because there might be some pride there. I don't know. I haven't really talked to anyone from the Czech Republic to get their thoughts on it. I don't want to undermine that in case that is important in the Czech perspective. I don't really know. But I do love that the film removes that, because it allows for us to, as I noted, tap into the character and not his nationality or his political beliefs. But beyond that, maybe most notably, is exactly what you're saying, in that Carey Mulligan and Adam Sandler do not pretend. There's not an ounce of them portraying a Czech accent or trying to render some sort of credence that they're from the Czech Republic. I mean, they're giving Adam Sandler aneurysms and Carey Mulligan mannerisms. Like that's, like she still has her British accent. He still has his American accent here. So by removing the Czech nationality or removing those borders, it does help the audience tap into those performances further, because we don't have to necessarily look at them as Czech. We just look at Linka and Jakub. That's who we're trying to connect with.
Yeah. And I think from the beginning, you started talking about the performances, and it just got my mind spinning about Adam Sandler in this film. And I know that I mentioned earlier that this is, in my opinion, I don't think it's his best. It's definitely up there for me. I think it's a fantastic performance, but it is in my opinion, the one where he has proven himself the most to be a completely like circular actor.
Mm,
He can do um, whether he's your cup of tea or not, he can do comedy. He has
mhm,
made many successful comedies um, for his entire career. Um, but you've also seen with stuff like Punch Drunk Love, with Uncut
mhm.
Gems, even we were talking about the Meyerowitz stories, bringing back Noah Baumbach.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
all three of these great, fantastic performances, but they all fit into those mannerisms that you said that Sandler gives.
yeah.
And so this, in my opinion, is the first time that he has sort of hidden and like sucked the energy all the way down to give a truly somber and soft spoken type of performance, one that
Mhm.
we haven't see. I went back and tried to look through most of it, and I don't think he even yells one time, which like
No,
for
no.
Adam Sandler is is a wild thing.
Yeah,
Um,
no, I love his performance here as well. And you're right, it's a very stoic performance. And it's interesting because you and we talked about this yesterday, but to reiterate, because obviously people can't listen to it,
mhm,
he is very good in these dramatic roles. But in all of those movies that you outlined there, he is able to mine raw emotion out of these cathartic outbursts that he has in those movies.
mhm,
There are times where he's also subtle, and you see this quiet vulnerability in his characters, but he does balance that out with these Sandler-isms that are very good, not just in his comedic roles and from a comedic lens, but from a dramatic lens as well. However, that is very much worn down here. That is undermined. It is taken out of his performance. It is very much stoic and melancholic all the way through. And I
mhm,
do really love that because it complements the way Jakub is written on the page. There's this duality to him where we know that he's been isolated for a long time. He's distant from his wife, much of it his own doing, admittedly, but also we come to find out he's never fully recovered from witnessing his father die when he was young. So there is empathy to be had, even if he's kind of unlikable at times. And I do think he's supposed to be. Then there's the aesthetics of the character. I love the makeup work. His face is sunken. There's an exhaustive demeanor to him that is palpable. His stoicism is poignant. There's clearly a weight that he is shouldering, and Sandler exhibits that very well. His chemistry with Carey Mulligan is my only question. I don't fully buy it throughout the film. At times, it's hard to believe them as a couple, but that could be because the film doesn't spend any time informing us why Lenka was ever attracted to Jakub, which still could have worked if the chemistry was still there. But I don't know if it is. But separately, I do think they are very good. And I do love Sandler and how he's channeling something, to your point, we just haven't really seen before.
yeah, and going back to that to the chemistry thing, that's something to where I could see for me as somebody who enjoyed the film, I can look back on a lot of their scenes and in a way almost trick myself into saying like, "Oh, they don't have chemistry because that's kind of how they're supposed to be." That's like the whole
Hmm.
point. Um, but at the same time, I do think that, I don't think that the writing of them as a couple, and I don't think the writing of Lenka as a character as a whole really does them or Carey Mulligan much justice. I think she's great with what she's given.
Hmm.
Um, I just think that there's a lot to be left on the table, a lot about, her life, um, her
Yeah.
upbringing, why, like you said, why she finds him attractive, why she is so eager to hold on to this relationship outside of the fact of being pregnant, why she is so, quick to run away when things start to get hard, um,
Yeah.
and why there was a lack of agency from the character that I thought Carey Mulligan still gave
Mhm.
a great performance, but I think a stronger written character and backstory would have not only helped Carey Mulligan, I think it
Mhm.
would have helped their chemistry, and I mean ultimately that could have been something that helped the film
Yeah.
even a little bit too. But I think
Yeah.
for all of the lack of chemistry that Adam Sandler and Carey Mulligan had throughout the film, I thought that what he and Paul Dano, the chemistry that they had together, I thought was couldn't be more perfect. Um,
Yeah.
I thought Paul Dano is he. I think personally he'll probably finish the year being one of my favorite voice performances of the year.
Mm.
I feel like he's soft spoken. He is eager to help. He's caring. Um, he also is stern, and he you can tell when he starts to get upset and when when he's hurting, looking through these memories from Jakob, and um, and I thought that Paul Dano really gave a brilliant voice performance, which is something that most actors, I mean, look at Super Mario. Most actors could show up and just give their normal voice and move on with it and not bring anything to the character. But
Mhm.
but that's something that I think he actually put a lot of care into, and it's very different. This is something that I have to bring this up because it is such a massive change. But if you listen to the audiobook of Spaceman of Bohemia, Hanush does not sound soft spoken. He sounds like a very, very old and like grumbly man. Um, Definitely nothing like what we got from the character. So not only did Paul Dano kind of make that decision to be more soft spoken, he also didn't have anything to base it off of.
Mm.
But I think it works with the character so much more. I think it shows so much more like care and attentiveness with
Mhm.
with what he is bringing, and a genuine interest as well. I mean,
Yeah.
we get into the reasonings why he's there, and it just for some reason, you can watch this movie and be like, oh, they haven't explained anything. This is just they're just throwing everything together. But for me, it kind of worked, and it was a lot through the performances and the chemistry between Adam Sandler and
Yeah.
Paul Dano that I felt
Yeah.
a genuine love and connection between these two actors.
Mm. Yeah, I do want to speak to Paul Dano here in a moment, but to circle back to what you were talking about with Carey Mulligan and the writing of Lenka here, I want to emphasize something you were saying there because I do agree that the character is underwritten. And, understandably, this is from the perspective of Yakub. So her point of view is going to be limited to some degree. And I don't need the character to be this fully realized supporting character because it is from the perspective of Yakub. But I do think it is a little troublesome though because she's such a significant part of the film. And we do leave Yakub's perspective for the story to emphasize her and where she's at emotionally as well. And there's enough of that to the point where the writing, I think, does become a problem at that point because it's, as you're talking about, we don't really know too much about her. We don't know any of her dreams or aspirations. We don't know much about the character aside from her feeling neglected in their marriage and that she's pregnant. beyond that, we have to infer a lot about Lenka, and I don't know if that always works here as a result. I think the film would have benefited by, it sounds a little disingenuous to say perhaps, but I think the film would have benefited if her perspective was actually lessened here and
Hmm.
it was strictly from Jakub's point of view, because then the redundancy would make a lot more sense, because
Hmm.
this is a man who was fearful that she is leaving him, or at the very least, he doesn't understand why she isn't responding to any of his messages. And so he's become a little despondent and a little fearful. And it, I think, makes sense of the redundancy of Lincoln in this film if it was fully from Jakub's perspective. And I think Carey Mulligan does a great job of bringing texture to the performance despite those redundancies. But I think they actually overwrite the character despite her also
Hmm.
being underwritten simultaneously. If that makes
Yeah,
sense.
no, yeah.
Like I think it's in that there's like a weird gray area there with the character. But as I noted in my opening thoughts, I think it's more effective than it isn't. But where this film does get a little wonky for me, it is with the writing
Hmm.
of Lenka there. And to speak to what you're saying about Paul Dano, I agree. He's really great in this film. Hanush as a character is wonderful. It's admittedly a little humorous when this giant arachnid shows up suddenly. I don't know what I expected from this film, but it certainly wasn't that. Like I had no
Hmm.
idea what I was walking into, and that was an interesting little turn there. But once you fall into the character, and it's interesting because it's this giant arachnid in space, and your first thought is maybe, are we supposed to be afraid of this character? And Jakub is. You see the panic in him when he first sees Hanush there. And I do love that immediately the film breaks that tension when the first line of dialogue we hear from Paul Dano to Jakub is, I'm not here to harm you. I'm not going
Hmm.
to eat you. Like immediately letting the air out of the bag, letting the audience as well as Jakub know that this is not alien. I'm not here to destroy you. And instead it's this wonderful subversive moment where you get this creature that is somewhat unexplained as to where he comes from, but also, we get enough of it to kind of fill in the pieces, and you get this warm and welcoming vocal performance from Paul Dano that is the beating heart of a lot of the poeticism of this film, and the sorrow that we get and the melancholy, and him trying to understand humanity and why we are drawn to relationships but then find ourselves in the middle of them separating emotionally from our partners, and the grief that Jakub is carrying, this, never fully recovering from watching his father die. Like all of those things in the Jakub character, Hanush is trying to tap into, and how that comes about throughout the film is incredible. It is very heartwarming in many ways.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's one of the that's one of the reasons I think the decision to make Hanush a a more, just softer spoken character,
Mm-hmm.
um, I think is similar to why the first time we hear Hanush, it is off screen and it is a I'm not going to hurt you. I think not only for Jakob, I think for the audience as well.
Yeah.
It's this sort of friendly sense
Inviting.
of
Yeah.
yes, inviting, that I think really helps for the character and I think helps, for the performance because I mean it is. I mean it's a spider with tentacles and talking lips and
Which is a little funny too. Yeah.
um and
Yeah.
it's all of these things, but it's also something that is so interested and cares so deeply and it's this creature that is from the beginning of time and has always been around, but it seems like this is just now when he's starting to learn all of these complex human emotions.
Yeah.
And you can see through the short time that he's with Jakob, you can see all of that blend together. He feels all of these things that Jakob is feeling, and one thing that you mentioned yesterday that I thought was a great point. I didn't really recognize it until you brought it up. Was through just through the makeup of of Adam Sandler,
Yeah.
and that he looks so beaten. Like
He
you
does.
could
Yeah.
tell that not only is he on this ship that is slowly falling apart, um, alone, which
Mhm.
is an insane choice to make
Yeah,
for
that's
a country
something
to.
we I wanted to bring up again as well. I emphasized this yesterday again. I'm so mad at myself that we lost all of that recording, but it is kind of hilarious. This is a film that features giant space spiders and this huge purple cloud in the sky.
Out by Jupiter,
Out
by
by
the way.
Jupiter, exactly. So it's not even just in our atmosphere. It's like way out there in the solar system. And the thing that's the most unrealistic to me is that he is alone on the spaceship. like that to me is a little weird. Like even in Alien, there's a crew, or in Solaris, there's still a crew there. Like for him to be by himself makes no sense.
That
But
was one of the funniest things to me was when he was like asking permission to fix things, and I
yeah,
was like,
like
"Are
dude,
they
you're the
gonna
only
like
one there.
remotely do it?"
Yeah. Like I understand you need that as a vehicle to tell this story, but it is a little humorous to me that that's the vehicle, or the
Mhm.
cipher here is okay. We're gonna send one astronaut out into space.
In the solo,
It'd be one
yeah,
thing if there was a group of them, but they somehow got separated, and so then he's by himself and then experiences what he does. But that doesn't happen. No, he's on this giant spaceship by himself. That
yeah.
was the plan from the beginning.
It,
You
it
know,
I mean, it really feels like a suicide mission,
it does. Yeah.
and it is, you know,
Anyway,
it's
not to
something that I can put
take
to the
away from your
side,
point about
but yeah.
Sandler and his
Um,
the weight that
but
he's carrying.
yeah, I mean, you can tell through, um, even just through using the bathroom, how much he's being like physically drained.
Hmm.
Through not only through the makeup, but through Adam Sandler's performance. You can feel that like slow turn towards, you know, how much did I mess up? I've been out here for 6 months and I feel like I'm gonna get
Hmm.
no closure from it or anything. Um, and yeah, I just think that's where the two of them flourish the most, is through that kind of exploration of, it's that sort of eternal sunshine sort of like exploration through the memories, um, that both Adam Sandler and Hanush both go on. And I think that's, for me, I think that is what is driving most of this movie. I think that's what drives it all the way to what, in my opinion, is a very, very strong third act. I feel like, for me, I feel like the third act of the film, from pretty much every aspect, um, hit pretty hard. I thought that
Yeah.
um, I thought that this is where the writing felt the most free. This is where the performances um, felt the most genuine. And going back to what you had said earlier, the third act is where, in a way, we sort of lose Lenka's point of view, and we're
Hmm.
seeing everything through through Yako's point of view, which I loved. I love
Hmm.
the line at the end that's, this is the beginning, this is the end, this is all of time, everything that's existed. And when Hanush asked him, what's not here? And I think, going back to that point, I think that would have been something that probably would have helped the film, would have been maybe less look into Linka um, as a whole. And I think it would have really helped tie together um, that kind of exclusion that he's been doing for all the time leading up to him going on the solo mission,
Mhm.
um, has been through excluding her. And I think, for me, I think that ending hit really well, but I feel like it would have maybe hit even harder had the audience as well as Jakob
Mhm.
been distant from Linka as a character, maybe a little bit more.
Yeah.
But yeah, I thought leading up to that third act, I thought the performances were all great. Um,
Well, and
Adam Sandler gives a one line where he just says Hanush, and it's so
yeah.
soft, it's
Mhm.
tender, it's everything.
No, it's really great. I do love how this film crystallizes, and it's interesting. You were just talking about Lenka there. I mentioned my discrepancies earlier in terms of the writing of the character and that weird gray area she finds herself in here. I also think about, again, bringing in the context of what you had noted yesterday. I haven't read the novel, but another element of it that you talked about is, you also mentioned it, I guess, earlier, even in this conversation, is how Jakub is in the shadow of his parents
Mhm.
because of his upbringing, their involvement in the Communist Party, and how that affected his childhood. And of course, watching his father die, and how that explains why he's so devoted to being on this mission. That isn't really in this film. We do get flashbacks to him as a child and what happened to his father. We understand that to some degree, but apparently there's much more of an emphasis in that in the book, particularly as it relates to his devotion, his convictions to being in this on this mission. That I do think would have benefited here. So again, going back to the writing, if you lessen Linka's involvement because it's from his perspective, but you provide that context
Mhm.
to why he's so devoted to being on this mission because of his childhood, I do think that makes sense of the disconnect that he has with Lenka, because a lot of their distancing comes from him being away for so long, whether it be in the training leading up to it, and of course being gone all this time on space in space, and she's of course pregnant, and so there's some conflict in the relationship that is born out of this distancing that has been widening leading up to him going on the mission, and then of course him just being on the mission itself. That context, I think, would have perhaps added a little bit of heft here. I could see why that is very much a big part of the novel.
Mhm.
Again, this is a film that's going for something more cerebral and ethereal in its convictions. It's very Mulligan in its sensibilities. And I do love that about the film, but I still think there was a way to maybe mirror that. And I say that to say, I think where the film gets really interesting for me, despite those hiccups, what I find compelling from a symbolic perspective, I guess, when you connect these ideas of loneliness and isolation in Yakub to the Hanush character. Now you can look at Hanush at face value and the relationship between this man and Arachnid and in space of all things, and how that evolves. And as we talked about earlier with Paul Dano's vocal work here, the character, like them together, is incredibly warming and inviting, and I love the poeticism at the heart of it. However, I do think there's a symbolic interpretation to be had here. That one is invoked early on in the film. There's a visual, early on where we see, something crawl out of Adam Sandler's face that kind of suggests where Hanush comes from, if you want to look at it symbolically. But what we learn about the character Hanush, that is, as it relates to this purple cloud in the sky as well, as in terms of him perhaps being representative of the beginning of time. So Hanush being representative of the beginning of time, if you symbolically or even literally tether that to Jacob, it's interesting how you look at the tethering of Jacob's childhood, that grief, that trauma that he had experienced, and how that explains the distancing he is experiencing now with Lenka. I do think that is ultimately what the film is trying to examine here. Is it a little ambiguous or a little cloudy in that regard? Absolutely. I think the ambiguity is intentional. Again, it's very cerebral. Could it have still been a little bit more cogent even inside of that ambiguity? Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that as well. I invoke Mulligan, and I do think this film is Mulligan in many ways stylistically. There's a reason Malick is the king of this kind of ethereal style. He knows how to work within those realms of poeticism and ambiguity, but still bring a powerful pathos to his movies. And I don't think this quite reaches those heights, but I think it does enough that you still feel for the character and you understand the symbolism of Hanush, how he's representative of the beginning of time or the beginning of Jacob, and how those traumas influence the distancing and his convictions as far as being on the spaceship, and how that's affected his relationship with his wife. I still think that is there enough that when the film starts to get emotional, when Hanush, begins to perish and we see Jacob kind of reveling in his newfound epiphany and these changes that have awoken his kind of own internal, cipher. It's very moving. And I was very moved. Maybe it's because Max Richter is doing a lot of the work here. I don't know. That's certainly part of it, but I was still moved nonetheless.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think for me, it's one of those things where I think it could be as easy as a conversation between Jakob and Hanush, because they allude to it. They allude to it quite a bit, especially towards the end of the film. That one of the biggest senses of like repelling of Jakob and Lenka was Jakob not being able to open up about his childhood.
Yeah.
And that started to get across later in. There's never that explicit like notion. I think Isabella Rossellini's character explains in a sense that he was almost drowned because of his father being an informant. But I think it would have been great for Jakob to have that sort of like come to terms with his childhood and with how hard that's been for him. And I think even you don't have to go in and really dive in on the politics and the informacy and all of that leading up to it, but I think you really get down to just a simple conversation where Hanush basically asks him, and he's like, why can you not speak about this? And I think honestly, that would, for me at least, would have solved a lot of the problems. I think it would have made his reasoning for going much stronger, because I think as the film as it is, I think the reasoning for going isn't as strong, especially as what the book um, gives along. You watch the film and you're like, well, it's a 6 month solo mission. Why is it that important that he does this? Um, and I think having like that simple conversation to really, delve through in that childhood trauma would have been something that I think for me would have fixed a lot of the issues that I had,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
throughout
Yeah,
most of it.
makes sense. Yeah. No, I don't disagree. And look, despite some of those gaps here, I think that's simply where tone and execution can really make a difference, I guess, because
Mhm.
I did feel those gaps from a storytelling perspective, but there's something about Adam Sandler's performance here. And to your point earlier, how different it is for him. Even though we've seen him do dramatic before, we haven't really seen him do this level of stoicism. This is more Ryan Gosling in First Man than it
Mhm.
is, let's
Brad
say,
Pitt and Ad
yeah,
Astra,
oh,
like
yeah,
something
exactly.
like that.
This is along those lines that is actually quite different than his previous dramatic work. And again, I think it's very good for the most part. And you couple that with Paul Dano's performance, and it's very somber, soft spoken. There's something about the earnestness of his performance and the sincerity of the Hanush character that is so poignant and moving. And then you couple that with Max Richter's score, which is so incredibly good here. It's really, really great. So like, despite the gaps, those individual crafts come together to, still bring some sort of lavish heft here that I very much responded to. I mean, same thing with Carey Mulligan. Like I liked the performance even if the writing of the character was a little underwhelming.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, I that's why, as I noted in my opening thoughts, I still think the film is more effective than it isn't. But yeah, sure, it has its gaps, it has its, its
Yeah,
issues, but overall,
and
like,
I
and I just love this style, like the Ad Astras of the world, the Solarises of the world, like that's my kind of sci-fi. So I was drawn in stylistically from the get go, and those individual crafts are there to again still make it radiant for me. Just narratively maybe missing some things here, and you're going to have that given the style here and how dense the novel might be in comparison.
yeah, and before we hopped on yesterday, I had asked you if you liked the movie because I knew
Uh huh.
that was gonna determine how the conversation was gonna go. But I agree. I think I'm not going to speak for you, but um, I think you'll agree that one of the reasons we can be so confident with our issues is because we really see something even greater than what is
Yeah,
even there.
I agree.
And while it does work, and while I thoroughly enjoyed this movie, and I will continue to thoroughly enjoy this movie um, for however long, um, it's just a few tweaks here and there, and I think it takes what, in my opinion, is a good movie to a great movie, and
Hmm.
potentially further.
I
Um,
agree.
you know, I think one thing that I want to talk about is, especially in the third act, because I think that's where it really kind of hits the high note. Is I thought the visuals of this were fantastic.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
I I thought the for a lot of it, I thought that there was that kind of Netflix sheen that was maybe a little bit too polished. I think it would have done better with a little bit of a grittier, grimier um,
Hmm.
sort of look to it. But I think once it really got into the um, the visual spectacle that was happening, um, which is the cloud.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
thought that was, just going back to those technical elements that really helped the film work.
Hmm.
Um, I thought that was something that, in my opinion, worked really well. It was effective for me, and it was believable, and it was um, that it's one of those things that, coupled with the performances and Max Richter's score, and like it all just culminated together to provide a climax that genuinely brought me to tears. Um,
Hmm.
which is, at the end of the day, that's all I ask for a movie, is
Yeah.
to at some point make me
Yeah.
cry.
Yeah, no, just to be moved in some way. No, I agree. And I share that same sentiment regarding the visuals, in the sense that I don't love the Netflix sheen here. I don't like that in general.
Hmm.
And it's why I somewhat hoped that this could have been brought to us by a different studio, in terms of its production. So we could have seen it in theaters and got something a little grainier and a little bit more tangible from a visual perspective. Because admittedly, the Netflix sheen is a little flat and dull. But I do think the composition and framing is very good here. The rendering of Hanush is great, as we talked about earlier. Again, kind of funny, but also immersive simultaneously. And I also love that the film doesn't emphasize pragmatism, I guess, is maybe the word there, because, you get to those final moments between Jakub and Hanush, and they're just there. They're just in space still having this conversation. They're not really even floating. They're just kind of still, which is kind of
Hmm.
a funny visual, but instead of getting bogged down by the realities of space, it allows for those two characters to connect. And that is what's most important there, to the point where, again, removing the, any sort of logic that could be applied to the scene. There's a moment where Jakub just pulls out of a spacesuit, somehow pulls out this huge jar of, I forget what it is, like some
It's
snack.
basically, it's like chocolate hazelnut. I'm pretty sure
Yeah,
in the
yeah, like a
book
chocolate
it's very
hazelnut kind of
obviously
spread.
Nutella.
Yeah, like a
But I
Nutella.
think they just did a giant jar of like chocolate hazelnut spread.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that Hanush had, tried earlier and really liked. That was his first taste of human food, and that was a funny little moment. And here they are outside the spaceship, again, just kind of still in space, and somehow in his spacesuit he has this
Hmm.
Nutella that he just pulls out. Like, it's kind of absurd, but works for the
Like
moment
he like
because
he's
of,
like, oh, I'm gonna go into this like purple cloud.
yeah.
Let me make sure I grab my Nutella before I go out.
Yeah. Again, because there's urgency, right? Because he sees Hanush go out there and he's like frantic, like, oh my gosh, I got to save him. But in the middle of all of that urgency, I got to go to the kitchen too. Like,
Yep.
it's just a little ridiculous. But again, that's what I appreciate about the film, not emphasizing realism. Instead of it's focusing on the poeticism of the moment, that
Hmm.
humanity, the bond between them, the connection that they had formed. As brief as it was, there was this incredible moment of transformation we saw with really the both of them, but especially with Jakub, and him realizing that, his flaws, and what had driven this disconnect between him and his wife, and how that connects back to this grief that he hadn't really grappled with previously,
Hmm.
and why it's important to grapple with these emotions even as a child. And even if you can't explain them or articulate them, it can affect you in the future. And Jakub hadn't really wrestled with any of that until he starts having these conversations with Hanush throughout the film. And how that comes about, as simple as it might seem, at least in the ways that I feel like I'm articulating it here, I still think it comes off extremely well. And yeah, the dynamic between those two characters is just really beautiful and warm. I loved it.
Hmm. Yeah,
Um,
no, and I agree.
yeah. Any final thoughts on Spaceman?
Um, yeah, I think one of one of my last thoughts is, you know, with the Netflix thing, um, it's it's a give and take that is for me. It's so hard to deal with internally because while I hate that kind of Netflix glossy sheen kind of look
Yeah.
to it,
Hmm.
I will say like you know 5 6 years ago, however long it was, when Netflix signed Adam Sandler on to do multi-picture deal, and he
Hmm.
started doing the Ridiculous Six and Hubie Halloween and all of those. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
I like Hubie Halloween, but Ridiculous Six not good. Um, but doing all those, I wonder if Netflix initially had signed him on to do all of these comedies that were going to bring a lot of people in, et cetera, et cetera. So it's one of those things where like if he has this deal and he has to make these films for Netflix, I would rather than be something like this that
Yeah.
is, in my opinion, far more interesting.
Yeah.
Um,
I would take this kind of ambition any day over
yes, and
mediocre.
I think that's for me. That's as a film studier, as a film fan, as a film fanatic, whatever. Um, I think for me, it's that ambition and that care that
Yeah.
I really am drawn to. And
No, I agree. I agree.
um, while I don't think a lot of this works, while I think some of the writing could have used maybe some fine tuning, maybe another person to come in and look at it,
Yeah.
so be it. Why I think this film works is because I think the performances are so strong. I think the direction is pretty good. Um, I think they lean into that sort of weirdness
Hmm.
that I can appreciate from as a fan. And
Hmm.
just my final thought. I know I said this yesterday, and I have to bring it back today because I've even today I've seen more people say this, guys. If you don't think Adam Sandler can do it after this movie, nothing's going to prove it to you. It
Yeah.
was Meyerowitz stories that he gave a really great dramatic performance in that is
Hmm.
actually funny enough. I think he is probably the most dramatic of that entire movie. I think
Hmm.
everyone else is so kind of out there, and he's
I
like
agree.
almost playing the straight man of the movie.
Yeah.
Um, he did that, and everyone was like, "Oh, can he do it again?" Then he does Uncut Gems. Oh, this is a tour de force performance. Can he do it again? Then he does Hustle. Hustle's
Mm.
a sports movie, whatever. Like it, don't like it, by the numbers, whatever. Great performance. I mean, he
Yeah.
earned that
He's good.
SAG nomination.
He's good. Yeah.
Um, and you know, if everything over the past 6 7 8 years hasn't proven enough that he can do this, there's just nothing more I can tell you because
Yeah.
he is consistently proving that not only is he willing to take the risk now, the rewards are fruitful. And I
Yeah.
think that he is going to continue to do films of this caliber. And for me, as a fan of Adam Sandler, as a fan of you know com- comedians maneuvering over into dramatic roles, um, I think that this is something that it just gets me all giddy inside.
Hmm.
I just I love
Yeah.
seeing stuff like this, and
Yeah.
now you've got the Noah Baumbach movies, so it's
And
just
that's
like
coming along soon. No, I'm with
yeah,
you. He's very good here. The only thing I didn't buy was his chemistry with Carey Mulligan. That was it.
which
That
is
was
fair.
really my only question. I didn't completely buy into that, but individually, I still think they're both quite good here. And yeah, I love watching Sandler in these dramatic roles. And this is unlike anything we've seen with him before. And I think he's quite effective here. Love his dynamic with Paul Dano. Dano is really quite excellent. So, yeah, good movie. I very much recommend it, at least if you're willing to submit yourself to the slow and methodical and, again, Solaris-like sensibilities here. It's very introspective, maybe too despondent for some people, but I think Sandler's good. I think he's very good. I think he's able to live up to the bill here, and I quite enjoyed Spaceman. I love its style and what it's trying to do. I found it all genuine and moving. So, yeah, check it out. If you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here, you can, of course, leave a comment if you're watching on YouTube, or you can reach out on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd. Just search for us, In Session Film. You can always email us, insessionfilm@gmail.com as well. Jacob, thanks for being here, man. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, I'm glad to be here. You know, I'm sad that the people won't be able to listen to the Lost Spaceman files, but
yeah.
But you know,
at least we got this one.
I think even in this second conversation, I think that there's still things that I'm picking up on the movie that I really enjoyed. And I'm glad you invited me on to come talk about this. I had a really great time, and I'm welcome to come on anytime.
Yeah, absolutely. Love your passion. Love what you brought to the conversation. It was great to hear. So yeah, I really do appreciate it. Where can the people find you on social media?
You can find me on all social medias at JTBerry97, on Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd. Letterboxd is probably the social that I'm most active on, especially now being in film school. I am watching some of the most obscure, insane, wild things that I can even imagine. So if you're interested,
there you go.
Some of them are not available in America. I'm sorry, but if you're interested, follow me on there. I log everything the second that I either can or the second I see it.
Yeah.
So
definitely give them a follow.
So
yeah, really do appreciate you here, good sir. Be sure to subscribe to the channel. Again, if you're watching on YouTube, like the video, or if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please rate and review us there as well. Really do appreciate you being here, Jacob. Do you have any final thoughts on anything before we get out of here?
On anything, that's huge.
I know. Broad, wide open.
No, go to the theater. There's so many good things out right now. Go see Dune. Go see Drive Away Dolls. Go see Kung Fu Panda 4. Go see Love Lies Bleeding. Go see everything at the theater.
Yeah, there's some good stuff coming out. Yeah, it's March, but and also prepare for the Oscars. It's happening this weekend, so get ready.
Maybe Spaceman will be at next year's Oscars.
Who knows? Yeah, we'll see. At any rate, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast.